I love to ask people the question, how many of us are people pleasers? And every time I ask this question, almost everyone raises their hand. So let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt hurt or bugged, pissed, frustrated, and you wanted to bring up an issue, but you didn't feel comfortable bringing it up because if you brought it up, it'd either turn into a fight or you'd get brushed off. But if you don't bring it up, then you just feel like a pushover and it turns into resentment. Tell me if you can relate to this. Jake and Ashley have been married for a couple years. Every day after work, when Jake gets home from work, Ashley makes dinner, and then after dinner, Ashley does the dishes. And while she's doing the dishes, where do you think Jake is? Downstairs watching TV. How do you think Ashley feels about this? She's probably not too happy, and she probably feels unappreciated. This happens day after day, and Ashley gives Jake plenty of hints and opportunities to redeem himself and to help out. But day after day, Jake is downstairs after dinner watching the TV, not helping out with the dishes. Until what? How long do you think this lasts for? One day, Ashley has finally had enough, and then she just goes off on Jake for being an inconsiderate slob that always leaves his dishes on the counter for her to do. What does she expect? That she's his maid? And how does Jake react? Does he go, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. You were totally right. I have been such an inconsiderate slob. Babe, from now on, I'll do the dishes after dinner." No, he's like, "What the heck? Where is this coming from? Like, don't you appreciate all the hard work that I do all day at my job to provide for us?" Then it turns into an argument and both go to bed feeling hurt and frustrated and unappreciated. Ashley is in a lose-lose. On the one hand, if she brings up the issue, it either turns into a fight or she gets brushed off. Either way, she's left feeling unresolved. And if she doesn't bring it up, then she's left feeling disrespected and it turns into resentment that poisons the relationship. Let's take this from a different perspective. I want to start with this idea. How people treat us affects how we feel about ourselves. When Jake doesn't do the dishes, Ashley feels disrespected and unappreciated. This feeds into her insecurities that she's not good enough, that people don't really care about her, and that she's just not that important. And she feels like a pushover. How does Ashley bring up the issue in such a way that she's able to stand up for herself and her boundaries without starting a fight, as well as gain respect and create a closer relationship? The answer is simple yet difficult. It's through understanding, vulnerability, and empathy. According to Brené Brown, a renowned researcher professor at the University of Houston, vulnerability as emotional exposure, risk, or uncertainty. And then on the other hand, courage is knowing the risk and putting yourself out there anyways. So the very act of being vulnerable is an act of courage that in and of itself garners respect. How do we show vulnerability when we bring up an issue? By being honest with our emotions and sharing how we actually feel when our boundaries get crossed. There's a difference between saying, "I'm angry and upset and frustrated when my boundaries get crossed," and saying, "I feel hurt, insignificant, unimportant, unappreciated, insecure, betrayed, disrespected, not good enough, taken for granted, alone." There's more vulnerability in exposing those emotions that are under the surface, that those feelings of anger and frustration and being upset are trying to protect and cover. When we bring up those more vulnerable emotions, that is the act of courage. That is what gains respect and also creates empathy and compassion. Those things are both important to help avoid triggering the defensiveness response. We also show vulnerability by going to where they're at and being empathetic and trying to put ourselves in their shoes and seeking to understand them, even though they hurt us or even if we disagree with where they're coming from. This is an important thing to remember. We can understand them without necessarily having to agree with them. How do we show this? By trying to connect with the other person and understand why they did what they did, why they believe what they believe. Here's the rule for bringing up an issue. Whenever we feel bugged, hurt, frustrated, miffed, pissed, angry, disrespected, cheated, treated unfairly, or resentful, that's an important one. We bring it up. These negative feelings alert us that our boundaries may have been crossed. And I want to address something real quick. Yes, we are trying to create change in the other person. We want them to change. But we don't want to bring up the issue in such a way that makes the other person get defensive, deflect, or brush us off. So the first thing that we need to do is create the conditions for a change. Otherwise, that defensiveness part of their brain is going to get activated and the rational part of their brain is going to get deactivated. And we don't want that. We need to bring up the issue in such a way that deactivates their defensiveness response and engage that rational part of the brain that's responsible for reason and empathy. Because we don't want to be the person that wins the argument, but then nothing changes. And then we don't actually get what we want. We need to create the conditions for change first. And it's super simple. The conditions for change is simply to have that defensiveness part of the brain deactivated and the rational part of the brain engaged. We do this by focusing the conversation on seeking to understand the other person. This creates a safe space for their subconscious to turn off those protection protocols. When our boundaries get crossed and we feel those negative emotions, we bring up the issue by following these 3 steps or guidelines. Number 1, we share our feelings and story. We use the I statement, developed in the 1960s, that often makes the listener less defensive. This is the template. When you, fill in the blank, I feel, fill in the blank, because blank. For example, when you leave your dishes in the sink, I feel kind of bugged. Maybe because it triggers my insecurities of not being good enough and not being appreciated. That's step 1. Share our feelings and story by following the template. When you, I feel, because. That's number 1. Number 2, transition from your story to their story. Be their lawyer. Be their advocate. Your job is to convince the imaginary jury that they are reasonable and justified and deserving of mercy. The best way to start this is with a statement like, but if I put myself in your shoes, or, but if I try to see it from your point of view, or, but if I try to see it from your perspective, and then be their lawyer. For example, but if I put myself in your shoes, if you're like me, you're probably exhausted and tired after eating a meal. And the last thing that you want to do is muster up the energy to do chores. And since I usually do this anyways, it'd be reasonable to assume that I don't have a problem with it, or that I want to do it, or that I like to do it, or that it's my responsibility to do it since I'm the one that cooked, I'm the one that made the mess, and therefore it's my responsibility to clean it up. And since I haven't said anything to the contrary, it would be reasonable to assume that that's how I feel. That's step number 2. Transition from your story to theirs and be their lawyer. Step number 3 is to check in. Ask a question like, how am I doing? What am I missing? This directs the conversation to now be about understanding them. If we're missing anything, they can then correct us or fill us in, and then we can better understand them. It also makes it so that the conversation doesn't turn into them justifying themselves or making excuses, minimizing it, trivializing it, or brushing it off. This initiates the conversation that creates the conditions for change. When people are approached like this, they feel understood and they have the opportunity to be heard. Let's put it all together. Hey Jake, when you leave your dishes on the counter, I feel a little bugged because it kind of hits my insecurities of not being important, not being cared about, and not being appreciated for working hard to make a good meal. But if I put myself in your shoes, if you're like me, when you get home from a long day and after you eat, you feel tired and exhausted, and the last thing that you want to do is muster up the energy to try to do chores. How am I doing? Is there anything I'm missing? By following these guidelines in this format, we're able to bring up issues in a way that garners respect because we're standing up for ourselves and our boundaries, as well as create a conversation to create the conditions for change and create a greater connection and closeness in the relationship. In the next videos, I'll go into each of the steps more in depth, but for now, this is a good overview. With this format, we can bring up issues in a way that conveys our feelings and emotions with grace, as well as maintain our composure. This earns people's respect. And then, instead of making the conversation about their behavior, we make it about understanding them. This hijacks the defensiveness response that is triggered when we tell them that they hurt us or that they did something that we feel is wrong. This effort to understand actually eliminates shame and creates that safe space for connection, trust, and respect. It eliminates the ego that gets in the way. And with the ego not being a barrier, the person is able to feel bad for what they did without being angry or upset at you. In fact, their respect for you increases, as well as their desire to be better and to treat you better. Something I want to do is create a little mini series of complaints and turning them into effective complaints to give you guys a wide variety of examples to learn from. So in the comments below, type out a complaint that you have. Something that someone does that makes you feel bugged, pissed, hurt, frustrated. It can be something super small and simple, or it could be something that's a really big deal and really important to you. And if you want to be more anonymous, I'll put my email address in the description below, and you can just click on that and send me an email. And then I'll pick some really good ones, and I'll make a couple videos showing how to turn those complaints into effective complaints. Thank you very much.